Hello, this is John Spink. I'm the director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. This is my presentation, Global Consensus on Food Fraud Prevention, for the GFSI International Workshop here in Jilin, China. This is October 27th, 2017. First off, before I get started, we're a research group and collecting data information is core of what we do. And we have a current food fraud terminology survey. It officially closes on the 31st of October, but we will continue to gather information afterwards. Also, you can use this as a reference. We're looking at terminology for food fraud and related terms for a number of different uses. And you'll see on the screen the link to the survey and a QR code. At any time during these presentations, please feel free to take a picture of the slides, to share them, or to use the QR codes. Please participate in this survey. To have a brief introduction about our research and our work. We are a university, and teaching is the core of what we do. We begin with education. That's our foundation. But then presentations like this are outreach. It's to get out to meet the people, to understand what's going on and gain new insights. That leads back to additional research, where we go deeper and try to understand the concepts. And then we apply that to our education, and the cycle continues. One of our core programs is a MOOC, Massive Open Online Course. These are free. The content is always free for our MOOCs. We have two. One is an overview MOOC, an overview of food fraud. That's offered mid-May and mid-November, which coincides with our semester. And Food Fraud Audit Guide. There's one currently open in October, and it will be offered almost monthly throughout the next year. Then we have executive education. These are programs done specifically for individual groups on site. We do them at Michigan State and around as well. Then we have graduate courses. These are online graduate courses. They are official Michigan State graduate courses, 3 credits. We have 5 of them that are related to food fraud. If you take 4 of those courses, you can receive a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. This provides an educational foundation, the baseline to help decision makers. If the credits are fun for you and you enjoy our program, you can roll those credits into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. Again, this is a real Michigan State University Master's of Science course. Just happens to be completely online. Primer on food fraud prevention. Also, before I get started, I think when we're looking at new topics, such as food fraud, and we're defining terms and sharing information, it's important to publish what we do and to provide an opportunity for discussion about the details. First off is looking at the concepts themselves. And how to start is one of the very first questions. We created this primer on food fraud prevention. It's a 2-page document that provides an overview. Also, how to implement. And partially, the idea to implement is around the world. So we've also had this translated and interpreted into Chinese language. So we say translate, that's just the words, and then interpret, which is the ideas. And before I get started, I need to thank our food fraud think tank. It's a brand owner and manufacturer group that helps support our work. Really, we focus on the standardized prevention practices. We help to lead policy and strategy where appropriate. And this provides internal and external leadership for the members. For one thing, when you are a member of the think tank, it's demonstrating internally at your company that this is an important topic and that you're already collaborating with other thought leaders. And then external leadership provides an opportunity for you to reach out outside your company and also enables us. Deliverables so far. Expanded engagement is one of the top focus areas for us. And so the funding in particular leads to us to be able to go to conferences such as Codex or ISO. If we're not there, we can't hear what's going on, and we also can't participate in the process. Food Fraud Audit Guide MOOC. That Audit Guide MOOC did come from recommendations from within the think tank. Expanded online on-demand resources such as videos on YouTube. Food Fraud Initiative reports. We occasionally do detailed reports regarding some aspect of food fraud. And then industry benchmarking surveys. As you saw from the previous survey, that's something we're starting to a lot more of. We're trying to learn what are people doing, how are they doing it, and what are the best practices. So to look at briefly overall the global consensus on food fraud, a real important initial activity was GFSI forming a food fraud think tank from 2012 to 2014 to consider the topic. And this is a key outcome from that was the work that we did. And one of the ideas was separating food fraud, food defense, and food safety in separate vulnerability assessments. This does not mean that you have 3 times the work. Actually, this becomes very efficient and is more effective. It takes less time to do a better assessment of each of these types of hazards. HACCP is hazards, food safety, TACCP is threat for food defense, and VACCP is vulnerabilities for food fraud. And this was then published, endorsed by the GFSI board in a shorter summary on the global position on mitigating the public health risk of food fraud. This was the GFSI board's statement of what they believed and intended for the future of food fraud within the GFSI program. Defining food fraud. It's been very interesting over the years to see how issues have changed and the focus has broadened in some ways and also become more clear in others. And in general, the overall scope and definition of food fraud is deception using food for economic gain. There are sometimes some variations that include intent or illegal, but generally it's this deception concept. The US FDA has a working definition of economically motivated adulteration, which only includes a substance, but do not be confused. The Food Safety Modernization Act does cover all types of hazards, regardless of their specific source. It could be a substance or it could be stolen goods that spoil. This broad definition is consistent with GFSI, the European Union, the UK, ISO, and others. The motivation is economic gain, and it's important to point out that food defense is fundamentally different when studying the motivation. Both acts are intentional, but the motivations are very different. For food defense, the intent is harm, either public health, economic, or terror. For food fraud, the goal is economic gain for the fraudster. They're trying to actively seek to avoid detection. The effect, there's always an economic threat. There's not always a public health threat. But there is always a public health vulnerability, meaning that even if people don't get sick immediately from this food fraud incident, the fact that this incident occurs could lead to a future public health threat. There are many types of food fraud. This is an excellent slide to give an overview of food fraud if you need to share with somebody. The food risk matrix. This has been very helpful in defining the differences between the different types of food risks. And we need to prevent by understanding the motivation. These are human adversaries, and we're trying to prevent them from action. When we look at all food risk, food safety and food defense are a result of an incident, and it's a root cause for some areas. And these are very traditional, and these are ones that we know. Food fraud was different when we started to consider prevention because we need to understand the motivation. E. coli operates differently than a human when they're trying to defraud or do food fraud. That's also very different from a human that's trying to do food defense, because food defense is trying to have an immediate public health threat. For food fraud, they're trying to avoid that threat. Also, food quality. And we put this in here because this is really across all of the food risk continuum. And most of the programs are managed under a food quality program. In one column, the action is unintentional. The other column, it is intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing. Again, for food defense, the intent is public health harm, and the motivation for food fraud is economic gain. This is where they differ, food fraud and food defense, because we reduce that opportunity for them to make money. That's the goal of food fraud prevention. Terrorism is one type of food defense. The US FDA focuses within the intentional adulteration rule on wide-scale impact harm, public health harm, and that's really terrorism. But food defense covers other topics, such as disgruntled employees, product tampering, and others. Now, it's interesting to consider that food risk matrix and to see how it applies to and in China. And I think many of you from China will recognize Dr. Chen's name there. This was a presentation that he gave at the Institute of Food Technologists conference in 2015. And you'll notice the exact colors of this food risk matrix. This is logical because we've worked with Dr. Chen and co-authored articles with Dr. Wu and others. So we've been co-authors on these topics. So it's very interesting to see this as a common starting point to explain the definition and scope of food fraud. Also, Dr. Wu presented earlier in 2015 at the Food Safety Summit, and you'll notice again the food risk matrix. What's especially important here is that there's even the identification of the different articles of the food safety laws and how they apply within the matrix. Also, Dr. Wu pointed out different types of food fraud incidents. Adulteration and counterfeit will be the most dangerous public health, but he does identify the other types of food fraud to show that the focus is on all types of fraud. Food fraud prevention cycle. This is the core. This is the base of everything. It's all about the fraud opportunity. It's all about the fraud opportunity. And I'll say it again, it's all about the fraud opportunity. We need to understand the motivation and the reasons why product fraud occurs. And this is based on situational crime prevention and the crime triangle. So when we're trying to understand this, we first need to understand the incidents. We review incidents, we look at horizon scanning, so changing things in the marketplace, and also public policy. Because if governments focus in a different way, and if there's different types of tests, then there's a greater chance for product to be recalled. This provides information coming in. And then we first conduct an initial screen. And this concept of an initial screen is based on managerial accounting practices called COSO, or Enterprise Risk Management, where there's a continuum from a very brief initial screening to a very detailed assessment. The first step would be, naturally, to conduct this initial screening. And it's important to look at all types of fraud at this point, because several of these types of fraud will be very simple, some will be more complex, and that allows you to focus. And the second breakthrough was looking at enterprise-wide risk assessment. That this risk needs to be compared to every other risk, because there are not an unlimited amount of resources, whether that's human or financial resources. Things need to be prioritized across an enterprise. And an enterprise can be a business unit, a company, or even an entire country. And then there's some type of rank. And once we look at this rank for the vulnerability assessment, we then consider countermeasures. This is a separate process to look at how we can reduce that vulnerability. So after implementing countermeasures, we consider the fraud opportunity again, and then conduct more detailed vulnerability assessments where required. And again, we also compare these to all other risks across the enterprise in an enterprise-wide risk assessment. What's really key here is that we see a cycle. This is a constant system. Any new information can feed in and be assessed. So if there's new incidents, you see that clearly coming in from the left, from the blue, into the fraud opportunity. If there's different changes on the way that a company or a country perceives their risks, their risk tolerance, their risk appetite, that would come in from enterprise-wide risk assessment. And then also from the bottom, countermeasures. If there's new countermeasures, new technologies, or other tests, those enter in at this point on the countermeasures. So you'll see this as a self-correcting process. It constantly evaluates the fraud opportunity, the vulnerability assessment, and then if that final risk is unacceptable to the enterprise. We frequently get questions about GFSI or other audits that it's just a checkbox, a yes or no question. That's very simple. What does that do, and how does that help? A key, there's often just this criticism about it. Is this bad for food fraud and for this stage right now? That's an interesting question to think about. We're not saying that we're implementing an entire system forever. We're saying we're starting the process. So is it bad for food fraud? No. And it's not, because the formal and official process has started. So is it question yes or no? Is that good or bad? A key is a series of events that occurs. So if a company will be audited and they realize they need to create a new document, they don't just let a local person create a new document and provide this official company statement. Usually there's quite a series of events behind that, especially the first time a formal document that's required under a certification. The first time it's required, there's a series of events. So they need to document that to the auditor. You have to create the document, and then there's an approval process. So just an auditor just asking yes or no questions creates this series of events. Now, in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, there may be more questions than the most basic questions, but at that point, we will have done a lot more research and we'll have a lot more insight. So the bottom line is a golden slide. We put these borders on here to point out the most important slides. This was summarized in a blog post on our website. about the food fraud compliance requirements. They're very simple for GFSI. Conduct a food fraud vulnerability assessment, yes or no. There's no further details at this point. Specific standards may have more requirements, but the bottom line is that the goal and the requirement is just to conduct a vulnerability assessment. Second, is it written? We frequently have people tell me that they've done a vulnerability assessment, but then they can't hand over a copy. Implement a food fraud prevention strategy. Again, there are no more details or requirements from the basic GFSI guidance document. So the question is just yes or no, and then yes or no, is it written? Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review, yes or no. This is a key again. The questions in the basic document are yes or no. In the future, we may find better processes and benchmarking, but we're not at that point yet. Note, address all types of food fraud, yes or no. And the GFSI position paper is clear. It states specifically that the adulterant substances, smuggling, theft, diversion, counterfeiting, and stolen goods are all required to be a part of the GFSI scope. And finally, address all products, from both incoming goods to outgoing goods, through to the consumer, yes or no. There's many concerns that a manufacturer can't control the product all the way to the consumer. That's key, and that is considered in the vulnerability assessments. Because if you as a manufacturer hand the product, sell the product to a competent retailer, and they legally buy the product, they now take much of the risk, and much of the control should be required by them. So we still conduct a vulnerability assessment, even though we state in that assessment that the responsibility has transferred to the new owner. And these have been summarized in trade journal articles that are free and open access. You can find them directly here or through our website. Recommendation: the focus on preventing all food fraud. These are things that you will have to do for your company or your country, and so you might as well start with the broad focus. At some point, you will have to broaden that focus. It's also most efficient to think about all types of fraud at the start, because you develop a system that naturally covers everything. All compliance. There's some teams that are only looking at the preventative controls rule or different specific laws, but really look at all types of compliance. At the very start of developing the process, it's most efficient to really consider everything, and then design the system to meet those overarching needs. You will have less rework later. Continue harmonization and calibration. It's very important for groups like GFSI, Codex, and others to create a central starting point and then apply to unique situations. So when we come together with definitions and the beginning of these types of systems like GFSI, then it creates a common starting point that we can discuss. And I emphasize this is a starting point, not an end point. Focus right now. One of the most important groups dealing with food fraud is the China Non-Traditional Food Safety Task Force. And I would say from the task force here, the GFSI group, really focus to the world, engage, and be a part of other activities. You can provide information and insight for those activities, and they can provide valuable information and insight to you. That includes Codex, ISO, the Food Integrity Project in the EU, the Food Fraud Network in the EU, and others. We have a lot of resources available. Feel free to take pictures of these slides, use them. These are public open access videos. If you conduct training, feel free to use these videos as well. They're all free and available online. We have many ways to engage with MSU. The MOOCs are a great way to start, so please see our website for more information on the dates and registration. And then before closing, I'd like to say thank you very much for so many people that have been so important and influential and supportive of our research. It's been an amazing almost 10 years on food fraud prevention research. People at Michigan State and others, groups like GFSI, have been very supportive. So I want to take a moment just to say thank you. With that, we'll take discussion.